All right, well, I know I'm between y'all and a baseball game, so I'm going to make absolutely sure I don't go over time here. But my presentation today is going to be going through some of the ways that we at T utilize Plexos in performing risk analysis, both in the medium term as well as in long-term studies. So I just have a couple of slides here to give you some background on who TA is. We're an organization that works with public power utilities across the United States, providing services like power trading, gas trading, portfolio management. We work primarily with municipals, joint action agencies, but we've also started to work with more electric cooperatives as well. This next slide, this just provides an overview of the different organizations we work with across the country. We operate in almost every organized market in the United States, with the exception of ISO New England. So getting into how we utilize Plexos for risk analysis, I'll start with how we do it in the midterm, and then we'll get into the long term, more of my bread and butter in the second half here. So midterm analysis generally focuses on next month to upwards of 3 years for us. And the basis of our midterm analysis is utilizing stochastic simulations. So just to make sure everyone's familiar with stochastics, it is a way to simulate a bunch of different outcomes for a given variable, as opposed to deterministic forecasts, which is just one prediction. This graph here just kind of visualizes what the stochastics from our process look like. In red, we have an expected value for, this is power pricing for a hub and SPP. And then the gray lines are all of the different stochastic simulations. You can see some realize above versus below the expected. And really, the reason we utilize this in both midterm and long term is just to capture uncertainty in different variables. So our stochastic process, I have a power price forecast here, but we also utilize stochastics for natural gas price forecasting, utility level load forecasting, as well as renewable generation forecasts. And those all feed into the Plexos models that we utilize to run resource dispatch. So for midterm analysis, this really just provides an overview of what the process looks like for us. We start with our stochastic forecast. This creates the inputs that are fed into Plexos. Again, those commodity prices, utility level load, as well as renewable generation. We feed these into our Plexos models. We have a unique model for each utility that we're working with, and Plexos does really all of the heavy lifting when it comes to determining optimal resource dispatch. Generally for midterm analysis, we're running a PASA, an MT schedule, and an ST schedule. And so for each of these stochastic draws that we're using, we'll create a unique set or a unique forced outage draw for each of those simulations. And then the last step here is just post-processing. Not everyone in our organization is an expert on Plexos, so we have a post-processing app that allows those who aren't as familiar with Plexos in our organization to view these model results, as well as evaluate prospective power or gas hedges, which is one of our primary use cases for the midterm analysis. I also do want to mention on this slide, generally when we're running stochastic simulations, we run around 700 iterations of stochastics. We've kind of found that that was a sweet spot for us, where you get a low enough level of iterations that it doesn't take a ton of time to run the simulation, but also you get stability in what your extreme outcomes or your 95th percentile outcomes are from run to run. Now, ultimately, this is kind of the final goal, or one of the final goals of this midterm analysis and running our Plexos simulations, is to create a forecast for future power costs over a calendar year or a couple calendar year period. So this is a distribution of projected power costs for a particular utility. And so not only are we looking for kind of what is the expected power cost, which we help utilities utilize for budgeting purposes, but also we want to understand, what's our 95th percentile outcome for these net power costs. And so the variable, or excuse me, the metric net power costs are including things like generation costs, load purchase costs, as well as any generation revenues for utilities operating in an ISO. Now, in quantifying risk, we have a couple of metrics that we usually stick to. The primary is that at risk, which is just the difference between 95th percentile outcome from our power cost distribution and the mean outcome. But we also evaluate expected shortfall. It really just kind of depends on what the utility's risk tolerance is as far as reducing variability in this power cost metric. Sorry, my clicker is running out of juice here. Oh, there we go. So I mentioned this earlier, kind of one of our primary use cases for running stochastic simulations in midterm analysis is evaluating the benefit of a prospective financial power or natural gas hedge. So we use these simulations from Plexos to generate our power cost distribution, and then at the end of this process, we have an application that will allow us to kind of layer on a financial power or gas hedge and determine, well, does this thin our distribution of outcomes for power costs in the future? And so this is kind of an example of when this would be beneficial. Is the red distribution is just directly the results from our Plexos simulations, and then the blue distribution is showing layering on a 30 megawatt power hedge for this particular utility. And really what we're looking for is over on the right-hand side of this slide that not just that 95th percentile number, but also are we reducing the at risk by layering on this financial power hedge? And so really, when it comes to midterm analysis, one of our end goals is being able to evaluate if a hedge is beneficial or not. It's not always this clear cut, applying a hedge reduces risk. And it really heavily depends on if a utility is kind of naturally hedged given their existing generation. So shifting gears to the long term, kind of traditionally at T, we utilize stochastics really heavily in midterm analysis, but not so much in long-term analysis. So when I say long-term, I mean really integrated resource planning studies, so studies that are going out 20 plus years into the future. And generally, we always ran deterministic simulations for these resource planning studies. We would run a base case simulation and determine optimal resource investment or retirement decisions going out 20 years. And then we would run scenarios. Changing assumptions or adding new constraints in order to determine how that impacts the investment or retirement decisions for a given utility. And so last year, we got involved in an IRP study for a utility that was looking for added risk analysis for each of these different sets of investment or retirement decisions in order to help them determine, this particular portfolio for a given scenario has, a higher level of natural gas resources or, renewable investment resources. We know what the expected outcome is as far as the financial metrics, but we don't know quantitatively what the risk associated with each of those decisions are. So that was kind of the genesis of wanting to add stochastics into our integrated resource planning studies. So this is kind of what the workflow looks like for us integrating those stochastics into our IRP studies. We start with a deterministic forecast, just one simulation. We run that through an LT plan in Plexos. Again, determine optimal resource investment or retirement decisions across a 20-year period. The next step is we generate a stochastic forecast for, again, things like commodity prices, utilities load volume, as well as renewable generation. And then we take that optimized portfolio from the LT plan, we place it back into our Plexos model, and we run an ST, an MT, and a PASA simulation in order to determine not just the financial impacts, running an hourly simulation for each of these different portfolios that we've created using the LT plan, but also what's the risk associated with those different resource mixes for a utility. And then our last step, just post-processing the results, similar to what we saw for the midterm analysis. So this slide, I know there's a lot going on here, but this slide kind of visualizes traditionally what the end results were from one of our IRP studies before we integrated the stochastics. So this is showing just some example data for a given resource planning study. On the x-axis here, we have 5 different scenarios that were ran for an IRP study. We had a base case scenario with a lower level of assumed load growth, economic recession, a scenario with data center load, a scenario where this utility became a full requirements customer of a larger organization, and then lastly, a heightened renewable goal scenario. The bars here represent, at the end of the 20-year period, what were the nameplate capacity of new resource investments for this utility. And that belongs to the left-hand y-axis here. On the right-hand y-axis, we have the levelized cost of energy across the 20-year period, and that's shown here with these black dots for each scenario. Now, I do want to mention these numbers have been obscured just because this resource planning study hasn't been made publicly available yet. So, traditionally, we kind of compared these scenarios qualitatively. We knew that there were different costs associated with different investment mixes, but we didn't really have a way to evaluate, well, which of these portfolios is riskier than the others. And so adding in the stochastic piece of this IRP study, this is kind of our secondary outputs. So this is showing visually running that PASA, MT, and ST schedule simulation. What is the range of outcomes financially for each of the different portfolios that were created by the LT plan? So these box plots just showing us what our expected value is, or mean value, that's those X's there, as well as the different quantiles output from our stochastic simulation. And then lastly, we have some outliers there for each scenario as far as cost goes. And again, the idea was we really wanted to be able to quantify if one scenario was much more risky than the other. By and large, we generally found that when it comes to that at-risk metric, there were some scenarios that were a little bit more risky than others. Reaching a more aggressive renewable goal did result in a higher level of risk. Really, kind of the main takeaway from this study was being a full requirements customer for this particular utility didn't make a ton of sense just because it resulted in much higher expected costs. The fact that you have very little risk when it comes to power costs for becoming a full requirements customer. Now, another kind of benefit from doing this sort of stochastic analysis for an IRP study is we can actually go into some extreme outcomes for commodity prices and pull the individual iterations that we simulated and determine what's the impact of having an extreme event as far as power prices go or gas prices go. A question we often come across is, well, this particular resource mix for a solution looks good on an expected basis, but what would happen if we had another Winter Storm Uri type event, for example? And so running these stochastics allows us to kind of identify, well, do we have an iteration here where an extreme outcome occurs as far as pricing, and we can pull those iterations for each of the optimized portfolios, determine if one portfolio performed better than the others financially. So this graph here, this is just kind of some example data of a distribution for Henry Hub natural gas prices. And so that line, or that circle there, just showing kind of a iteration that we would identify and pull the results for each of the portfolios. So kind of some takeaways here from this presentation. Really we've utilized stochastics heavily in midterm analysis for a long time, and we're just kind of getting there as far as adopting stochastics for long-term analysis. Utilizing the stochastics in an IRP study, it not only allows us to better quantify some of those financial risks associated with different resource mixes, but also, it allows us to evaluate how a particular portfolio might perform given an extreme price outcome. So this is all of the slides I have. I will open it up to questions.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is, do you find yourself using the I know Plexos has some stochastic functionality inside the model where you can define a distribution and how that is sampled. Mm-hmm. Do you find yourself using the built-in functionality for stochastics, or doing a lot of that stochastic analysis exogenously?
So we do a lot of it exogenously. The reason, I'll give you a little bit of history on why. So the prior production cost model vendor we used before Plexos didn't have that functionality. And so we kind of already had the system in place for that. And so for that reason, we've kind of continued the stochastic process we already had established with Plexos.
Two questions. One is, have you ever modeled or incorporated other stochastic variables like capital costs and how that might change over time? And then correlations between things like a high load, high gas price type situation, correlations between those stochastic variables. How do you handle that?
Yeah, so for your first question, we haven't considered variability in capital costs of projects. I think we just had an issue with the availability of data and helping define like an accurate variance for what those capital costs could be, unfortunately, but it's certainly a good point. In your second question, we do capture those correlations between the different stochastic variables that we're simulating. For kind of midterm analysis, we rely on historical relationships between different stochastic variables. Something that we actually did for the IRP study was, rather than using the historical relationships, we took the hourly correlations in our deterministic forecast, and we actually utilized to govern the correlations for our 20-year stochastic simulation. Reason being was particularly for markets like SPP and ERCOT. Historically, we haven't had quite as strong of a relationship between solar generation and power prices, but once we add a lot more solar onto those systems over the next decade, that relationship will get a lot stronger.
Hi, can you go back to the slide where you were explaining the event with, that one. So can you explain just a little bit more detail? So this event happens basically like a stress event, and then did you say you pulled the LMPs from this event and put them into each scenario? Like how are you doing that step?
Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll look at the simulations for either a power price variable or a gas price variable. In this case, we got a gas price variable. And we'll determine, okay, we have an extreme price outcome. What iteration of our stochastics is that? And let's say it's iteration number 50. Then we'll look back in our stochastic simulation that we ran, pull iteration number 50, and determine, okay, how did each portfolio perform in that particular iteration? Does that make sense?